Picture a world with tax cuts and deregulation of business everywhere. That was the US under the Reagan administration in the 1980s. The rich got richer, but the poor stayed poor. It was an era loved by many, yet it formed a national debt pile that quickly increased in size. To understand how it all began, what it looked like, and why it matters today, we must delve into some history and economics. In the 1970s, the US suffered severe economic recessions, and those recessions weren't just normal ones. While most recessions are caused by negative demand shocks, which is the shift of aggregate demand to the left, these recessions in the 1970s were caused by negative supply shocks, which is a shift of the aggregate supply to the left. Economists call this stagflation. The problem with stagflations is that there are no simple solutions to them. So economists began to gather ideas, searching for ways to alter the aggregate supply. One economist called Arthur Laffer came up with an idea in 1974. At a dinner where he met with the staff members of the Ford administration, Laffer took out his pen and drew a curve on his napkin. While his original napkin looked like this, most sources today show the flipped version. Laffer proposed that there lies a relationship between the tax rate and tax revenue. On the horizontal axis, the tax rate ranges from 0% to 100%. And on the vertical axis, the tax revenue goes from low to high as a conceptual range. At a 0% tax rate, there's simply no tax revenue. At 100%, however, there's also zero tax revenue. Why? Because logically speaking, an 100% tax rate means that everything a person earns goes to the government. In that case, there's no point in working at all, so no one would want to work, thus generating zero tax revenue. Then what happens in between the two extremes? At the start, the tax revenue is going to increase as the tax rate increases. But over time, the curve will flatten out until it reaches a certain point when some people start losing the incentive to work as much, causing the tax revenue to decrease even as the tax rate increases, until the tax revenue reaches zero. More importantly, this suggests that some people have been less willing to work due to the high tax rate, hence inhibiting economic growth. The Laffer curve and its implications became the basis of supply-side economics, or economics that attempts to change the aggregate supply. You see, one factor that controls the aggregate supply is productivity, which is how much a worker can produce within a given time frame. Laffer believed that the tax rate had already exceeded the sweet spot that corresponded with the maximum tax revenue. Thus, decreasing taxes can not only increase tax revenue, but also incentivize people to become more productive, which would in turn produce greater supplies of goods and services. This would counter the stagflation, decreasing the high inflation rates and increasing employment. Sounds like a great plan, right? From what we know, Ronald Reagan certainly loved it. Throughout his presidential campaign in 1980, Reagan, along with his Republican supporters, advocated supply-side economics. They argued that tax cuts, supplemented by deregulation of business and promotion of free trade, would increase the private sector's productivity in the short run and increase investment, which allows for more efficient production in the long run. So guess what Reagan did in his first year of presidency? He lowered the taxes.
You sent a message that you wanted a new beginning. I suggested an across-the-board tax cut spread over those same 3 years.
By signing the Economic Recovery Tax Act of 1981, Reagan lowered the federal income taxes for everyone, but most noticeably for the rich. The lowest federal income tax rate was lowered from 14 to 11%, and the highest from 70 to 50%. Supply-side economics became so attached to Reagan that people referred to it as Reaganomics. But did Reaganomics actually work? The answer is somewhat complicated. If we construct a table of pros and cons, we can find the arguments on both sides. On one end, supporters of Reaganomics point to more controlled inflation rates and a lower rate of unemployment, which altogether combated the stagflations. In addition, the increase in investment stimulated economic growth throughout the 1980s. Nevertheless, critics show that Reaganomics placed more money in the hands of investors and higher income Americans. And as a result, widened the income gap, and reduced economic mobility. It also increased the national debt significantly, as the government spending were not reduced in proportion to the reduction of taxes they collected. If we look closely, the pros on the left are mainly short-run benefits, while the cons on the right are long-term consequences. In a simplified evaluation, Reaganomics promoted prosperity in the short term at the expense of economic and societal burdens in the long term. As for the Laffer Curve, many economists today still regard it as a pedagogical tool for understanding tax policy. However, the hypothetical maximum revenue point on the Laffer Curve for any economy can only be estimated, and such estimates are controversial. While Reaganomics found some success in recovering America's economy, there are various confounding factors behind the success, and whether tax cuts played a major role remains debated. Reaganomics continues to influence us today. When we see issues over tax policy or a widening inequality gap, we see shadows of Reaganomics. Another legacy of Reaganomics was the huge federal deficits of over $200 billion a year, which set a precedent for the US government to spend more than they collect. Today, this has become a common trend as different administrations seek to carry out social welfare programs at a cost above their tax revenue, which is why it's not surprising to see the national debt increase year after year. That is all for this video, and I wish you learned something about the Laffer Curve and Reaganomics. Bye.